Hello, this is our tutorial on discrete domain and range. We're going to be looking at determining discrete domain or discrete range from a table, a mapping, a set of coordinate pairs, and also graphs as well. That's just important to know at the beginning, so I'm going to label this on the screen that when we're talking about domain are our x values. So I'm going to put that here. When we're talking about range are our y values. And on a table, it's pretty easy to see since they usually label it with X and Y like we see, but sometimes they might use different letters. But notice the X is always on the left side. So even if they have a different letter there, that letter, like even if they have like an A and a B, that letter A represents X values because the X is always on the left side. So even if they use different letters, it's just important to know that the X is always on the left side, the Y is on the right side. So it's sort of alphabetical. X before Y, X on the left, Y on the right. So if I'm wanting to know what my domain is, and I'm always going to talk about, at least for consistency right now, domain first. Domain are my X values. So I'm going to highlight those. So if you see the highlighter, that's the domain. So since the domain is the x values, I'm going to label it here, then when I write domain, I know that my domain values are the ones in that table. The -3, the -1, the 1, the 3, and the 5. Now, since this is discrete, meaning individual values, individual points, we just list those points inside curly brackets and we separate each domain value. We don't list the points, we list the values, excuse me. We separate each domain value with a comma. And then the range values are the one on the right. So those are the y values. So we can do the same thing there. We can list those. Now, you don't have to put them in numerical order. I can put them in the order that's actually on there on the screen. So I've got a 9, and then I've got a 1. And if you want to, one of the things that you can do is check it off to make sure that you've written it down. But then I've got another 1 here. Well, I've already got a 1 in my answer, so I don't have to write it twice. I can just check it. It's already there. And then I've got a 9 again, and I've already written it, so I'm just going to check it. And then I've got a 25. So even though there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sets of numbers there, I only have 3 values or 3 numbers in my answer because you don't repeat the numbers. Even if they're repeated in the table, you don't repeat them in your answer. Now that answer is perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with it. However, a lot of times we see the values written in order from smallest to largest or from low to high. So if we were to do that, the way that we would see the range written would be 1, 9, 25. You don't have to write it that way, but that's the way we see it a lot of times. Okay, so same thing happens with our mappings. I come over here, I'm going to highlight this. The ones that I'm highlighting are always going to be my domain because it's always domain first and then range. So then my domain answers are 3, 4, and 9. And my range answers, or my range values, would be the other side, 4, 5, 8, and 10. And you might have called these inputs and outputs. Inputs are the same as the domain, outputs are the same as the range. Okay, so then when we get to coordinate pairs, it works much the same way, except for it's not organized quite as easily. But when we organize ordered pairs, it's always X number first, Y number second. In every single pair, it works that way. X and then Y, X and then Y, X and then Y. So just like before, our X is our domain, and that's the one that I'm always going to highlight so that I know if I highlight it, it's a domain. If I don't highlight it, it's a range. So all these ones that I'm highlighting, and I'll also mark it above them, those are the domain numbers. So if I come down here to write the domain, it's pretty much the same thing. So I've got a 0. And again, since these are all spread out, it is kind of nice to sort of check them off that you did it. I've got a 3. I've got a 4. I've got a 0, but you know what? I've already written a 0, so I don't have to write it twice. I'm just going to check it off. And I've got a 4, but I've already written a 4. I don't have to write it twice. I'm just going to check it off. Those are the domain values. Now the range values are on the other side, so I'm going to label them. Those correspond to the Y numbers. Okay, so I'm going to come down here and I'm going to write them. I've got a 2, and then I've got another 2, but I don't have to write it twice. I can just check it off. I've got a 5, and then I've got a 3, and then I've got a 6. And once again, they don't have to be in order, but if you wanted to write them in order, because a lot of times that's how we see our answers, then they would be written 2, 3, 5, and 6. These are actually the same, but some people would consider the second one that I'm starring a better way to write the answer because it's in order. Okay, we're going to look at graphs later, but this gives you an idea right now of how to do discrete domain and range across tables, mappings, and coordinate pairs.